Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
So today we're tackling something pretty charged. It's about a statement from South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, concerning some white Afrikaner citizens leaving for the U.S.
Yeah, and our main source here is a BBC News report, which really lays out the starkly different ways this whole situation is being viewed.
Exactly. So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to unpack those different perspectives.
Yeah.
What's driving them?
Right. Because on one hand, you have Ramaphosa calling these emigrants cowards. Pretty strong language.
Very strong.
And then on the other hand, you have the U.S., specifically under President Trump, when this report came out, actually granting them refugee status. They cited racial discrimination and a terrible situation back in South Africa.
It's a real clash, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's start with Ramaphosa's comment. The quote was, "When you run away, you are a coward, and that's a real cowardly act."
Mm-hmm.
What's behind that? What's his reasoning, according to the report?
Well, the BBC suggests it's tied to South Africa's ongoing efforts to, deal with the legacy of apartheid, the inequities.
Okay.
His point seems to be that, look, maybe these people are unhappy with how things are changing or maybe how fast.
Or at the pace of change.
Exactly. But he argues they should stay, be part of the solution, not just leave. He even predicted they'd return. Said something like, "I can bet you that they will be back soon because there is no country like South Africa."
Like a challenge almost. And how did that go down? The report mentions reactions.
Oh, yeah. It apparently angered quite a few people, especially on social media. They saw it as an insult, like he was dismissing the reasons they might feel they had to leave.
It definitely touches a raw nerve.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the legacy of apartheid.
Yes, and that's crucial context, especially the land issue. Even now, 30 years post-apartheid?
We're in that.
Right. And black farmers still own only a small fraction of the best farmland. Most of it is still held by white South Africans.
And that causes a lot of anger, I imagine. The feeling that things haven't changed enough.
Precisely. It fuels that frustration about the slow pace of transformation.
Okay, so that's the backdrop from the South African side. Now let's flip to the U.S. position. Completely different take.
Totally different. So President Trump's administration granted refugee status to this group, 59 people, when they arrived.
And the justification from the U.S. side, what was their reasoning?
Well, publicly, they leaned on these claims, which people like Elon Musk also amplified, about a so-called genocide of white farmers.
Right. And we should be clear, the report notes that claim is widely discredited by many experts and organizations.
Absolutely crucial point. But that was part of the narrative. And also, the U.S. expressed concern about the South African government potentially seizing land from white farmers without compensation.
And their arrival wasn't low-key, was it? There was a bit of a welcome ceremony.
Yeah, Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landau was there. He said they'd been living under a shadow of violence and terror. Very dramatic phrasing.
Wow. Violence and terror. That's serious stuff.
It is. And the welcome itself at Dulles Airport involved American flags, balloons. It was a very public statement.
A clear signal. And Trump himself had talked about this before, right?
Yeah.
Offering to resettle white Afrikaners?
Yes, he had. He described their situation as terrible and offered the U.S. as a refuge.
So who actually qualified?
Yeah.
Was it just any white South African? What were the specific criteria the U.S. used?
No, it was more specific. According to the U.S. Embassy info cited by the BBC, you needed South African nationality, obviously. You had to be Afrikaner or from another racial minority. And crucially,
Yes.
you had to demonstrate either past persecution or have a well-founded fear of future persecution. Evidence was required.
Okay, so not just anyone could claim it. They had to make a case.
Right. It was based on those specific refugee criteria.
And this whole thing escalated, didn't it? The report mentions Trump threatening to boycott the G20 summit if it was held in South Africa.
It does, yeah. He apparently said he might skip it unless the situation is taken care of. That shows how seriously the U.S., or at least his administration, viewed it, or perhaps wanted to pressure South Africa.
That's a pretty big diplomatic threat.
Huge.
Yeah.
Using a major international summit like that as leverage. So let's get back to the South African government's view on all this, especially on the land issue and this whole terrible situation narrative.
Okay, so we know land reform is a massive ongoing issue. And Ramaphosa signed that controversial law earlier in the year.
Right, the one allowing land expropriation without compensation in certain cases, tied to equitable and public interest.
Which sounds quite open-ended. Has it actually been used?
Well, that's the thing. The government, according to the BBC, says no land has actually been seized under that specific act yet. So the law exists, but its application, that's still developing, it seems.
Then Ramaphosa pushed back directly against the U.S. claims, didn't he?
Yeah.
In talks with Trump.
He did, reportedly told Trump straight up that the U.S. assessment was not true. He really rejected that narrative of persecution.
And he made a point about South Africa's history, too.
Yeah, quite a striking quote. He said, we're the only country on the continent where the colonizers came to stay, and we have never driven them out of our country.
What's the implication there?
I think he's saying Afrikaners are part of South Africa, intrinsically so, not some foreign group being targeted.
Yep.
His view seems to be they belong, they're citizens, not persecuted outsiders. He explicitly said these immigrants don't fit the bill for refugees.
So completely different framing. One side says persecution, the other says they're integral citizens who shouldn't leave.
Exactly. And the BBC piece also briefly flags a few other related things, just sort of painting the wider picture.
Like what?
Well, there's a mention of a racially charged row between Elon Musk and South Africa over Starlink.
Okay. Another point of friction.
Yeah. And references to other BBC articles, one asking about Trump's motives, another noting nearly 70,000 South Africans were interested in U.S. asylum.
70,000. Wow, that's a lot of interest.
It suggests a broader unease for some, perhaps. Also mentions of articles on the geopolitical chess game, and even U.S. aid cuts impacting HIV treatment in South Africa.
So this isn't happening in a vacuum. There are lots of other threads in the U.S.-South Africa relationship.
Definitely. And the report mentioned Ramaphosa was due to meet his U.S. counterpart, suggesting, ongoing dialogue despite the tensions.
Okay, so pulling it all together.
Yeah.
The core conflict is Ramaphosa seeing this emigration as, well, cowardice, a failure to engage with South Africa's challenges.
Right. Versus the U.S., at that time anyway, interpreting it as people fleeing legitimate persecution and granting them refugee status.
Two completely opposing narratives rooted in the same events, but filtered through very different historical lenses and political priorities.
Precisely. You've got the shadow of apartheid, the intense politics around land reform, and these fundamentally different takes on what's actually happening on the ground.
And it has real-world consequences for diplomacy, like that potential G20 boycott threat. It shows how domestic issues can easily spill onto the international stage.
For sure. It really makes you think about how countries perceive each other's internal struggles, especially when history is so complex.
So it leaves us, and you listening, with a lot to chew on. When you consider these viewpoints staying to fix things versus leaving for safety or opportunity and layer on South Africa's unique and difficult history, what does resilience actually look like in a nation facing such deep changes?
Yeah, and how do different groups even define running away versus, say, seeking security or a better future? It's complicated. There aren't easy answers here.
Definitely not. Something to keep thinking about. Thanks for walking us through this complex picture.
My pleasure. Lots to consider.